upon something truly bizarre, a leather-bound journal lying just off the boardwalk near the Grand Prismatic Spring. Normally, I wouldn't pay much attention to something like that, but its appearance was striking. It had that classic, rugged look I've always been drawn to. Curious, I picked it up and glanced around, expecting to see someone searching for it. The area was crowded with tourists, yet no one seemed to notice the missing book. I even called out that I had found a journal, hoping its owner might step forward. A few people glanced my way. At first, I just wanted to see if there was a name. Flipping through the pages, I couldn't stop. What I read felt unreal. Initially, I assumed it was just a spooky story, something you might find in an online horror forum. But the further I read, the more it felt like something far more serious. Whatever this was, it didn't read like fiction. Something strange is happening at Yellowstone, and I'm convinced people need to hear about it, before it's too late. I know this might come off like some kind of elaborate prank or the rantings of a conspiracy theorist, but I'm telling you, it felt authentic. After reading the entire journal, I tried to dismiss it as just a well-written story. But I couldn't shake it. My curiosity got the best of me, and I ended up using the rest of my vacation to follow up on what the journal described. What I uncovered was far more disturbing than I ever expected. The journal had been written by a woman named Sarah, who worked in the Old Faithful Basin gift shop. She came across as outgoing and personable, someone who struck up conversations with visitors and was friendly enough to become a familiar face to returning tourists. But things took a dark turn when she began noticing an unsettling pattern. Guests were vanishing. Sarah described how people began asking her about missing travel companions, relatives or friends who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Oddly, these disappearances weren't being acknowledged by the park. The daily bulletins made no mention of missing persons. What's more disturbing is that many of the people who went missing had reportedly broken a park rule shortly before disappearing, and shortly after, a park ranger would confront them. According to the journal, family members who stayed behind would tell Sarah that when they reported the disappearance to park officials, they were reassured that their missing loved one had been spotted leaving the park. But their calls and messages would go unanswered, and no one could reach the missing person. Sarah tried to reassure people, blaming the spotty cell service in the area. But as the incidents multiplied, her concern grew. Despite the number of cases, none of the missing were ever officially listed. Sarah began taking matters into her own hands. She offered to help families keep watch and even exchanged contact details with several of them. I know what you're probably thinking, so did I. I decided to verify what I could. I checked Yellowstone's official records, including the missing persons registry. None of the names from the journal showed up. Not a single one. To dig deeper, I called the Park Service myself. Posing as a journalist. Every time I asked about someone mentioned in the journal, I was told, without fail, that the person had been seen leaving the park. Word for word, the same response each time. It was like a script. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. The official narrative didn't add up, and I couldn't just walk away from this. I had to know more. So I spent the rest of my trip chasing down any lead I could find. In the following entries of the journal, Sarah described how her investigation into the disappearances grew more intense. Her evenings were spent digging through whatever information she could find about each missing person, hoping to uncover patterns or links between them. She also started asking questions, quietly and cautiously, posing seemingly harmless inquiries to park rangers. Things like, did anyone report someone missing from Campground A? Or were you the one who saw this individual leave the park? Became part of her daily conversations. After a few weeks of these subtle probes, Sarah came home one evening to find a note pinned to her front door. What was written chilled her to the bone: stop asking questions, or you might lose that job you care so much about. Instead of backing off, the threat only fueled her determination. It was becoming clear this wasn't just a case of lost tourists. Something more disturbing was happening behind the scenes. Despite her persistence, Sarah wasn't turning up anything solid, until one evening she overheard a conversation between two park rangers. Their hushed tones and glances around suggested they were discussing something they didn't want anyone to hear. Intrigued and suspicious, Sarah decided to follow them after her shift ended. Lost in thought and eager to keep them in sight, she nearly bumped right into them as she left the store. With a nervous laugh, she apologized cheerfully, "Oops, didn't see you there. Have a great night," and quickly made her way toward the parking lot, pretending to head to her car. Once she was certain they weren't watching her, she slipped behind a tree and waited until they moved further down the trail. Then she began tailing them from a distance. Not being accustomed to long hikes, Sarah quickly found the trek exhausting. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, shadows lengthened and the path grew darker. The rangers showed no sign of stopping, and Sarah's nerves started to fray. Thoughts of animal encounters, like the ones she'd read about in park incident reports, started creeping in. Of her, hours passed, and under the faint light of the half-moon, she continued following them. Just as she was about to give up and turn back, something caught her eye, a soft glow over a nearby ridge. Moving quietly from tree to tree, Sarah crept closer. A strange smell filled the air, a mix of pine and sulfur. At the top of the ridge, she finally saw it, a small cabin with an odd-looking chimney rising from the center. She froze, debating whether to approach. A mix of dread and curiosity washed over her. But in the end, fear won. Not knowing what might be inside, she turned back. The journey back was long and disorienting. She nearly lost her way more than once, and by the time she reached the parking lot, she was mentally and physically drained. She jumped in her car and drove straight home, glancing nervously in her rearview mirror the entire time. Luckily, it didn't seem like anyone was following her. Back in the safety of her home, she finally allowed herself to relax, but her thoughts kept circling back to what she had seen. Despite the fear, she wasn't giving up. Sarah wrote that she planned to return to the mysterious cabin during daylight hours on her next day off. Though she slept poorly that night, nerves and excitement kept her restless. When she woke the next morning, she was more resolved than ever to find out what was really going on. In her own words, she felt like she had stepped into one of the mystery novels she so loved to read. The following morning, Sarah skipped her usual breakfast, grabbing a couple of protein bars instead. She dressed carefully, knowing the hike ahead would be long and possibly strenuous. Rather than parking at the gift shop as she normally would, she chose a discreet spot farther up the road, just off a faint, unmarked trail. She knew that if any park rangers noticed her car there while she wasn't on shift, it might raise questions. Keeping a low profile was crucial. For hours she hiked through dense forest, constantly glancing over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed. She remained off the main trails, determined not to be seen. After nearly 3 exhausting hours, fatigue and a creeping sense of dread began to set in. She feared she had taken a wrong turn and might be lost in the vast wilderness. But just as panic started to rise, she crested a familiar ridge, and there it was. The strange cabin. In daylight, the structure looked even more peculiar than it had under moonlight. It was roughly circular in shape, with a tall central vent or chimney that released a steady stream of foul-smelling vapor. As she observed more closely, Sarah realized it wasn't smoke, it was steam. The revelation hit her like a jolt. The building had been constructed around an unmarked hot spring, one that didn't appear on any official park maps. The exterior appeared old, likely dating back to the early 1900s, but parts of it had been renovated recently, possibly within the last decade. The contrast between the vintage facade and the newer additions was striking. For the next hour, Sarah stayed hidden, watching for any signs of activity. When she was confident no one was around, she cautiously approached. Peering through the windows, she confirmed the place appeared empty. Circling to the main entrance, she hesitated for a moment. The door was unlocked, which struck her as odd. Any legitimate park or geological site would have been secured. She nearly turned back then, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. Slipping inside, she closed the door behind her as quietly as possible and crept through the entry hall. To her left and right were 2 smaller rooms. She chose the one on the right, hoping it might contain some records or explanation for the strange cabin's purpose. What she found was far more disturbing. Inside were rows of neatly folded clothing, each stack complete with shoes, hats, and sometimes backpacks or purses. Many of the piles even included cameras. The careful arrangement of each set was unsettling. It looked almost ritualistic, as though someone had taken great care in preserving them. The room reminded her of scenes from old horror films where killers created eerie tributes to their victims. Her chest tightened as she stepped further inside. There had to be dozens of these stacks, maybe 50 or more. She noticed the clothing at the far end of the room appeared older, dating back several decades. Some looked like they were from the early 20th century. Whatever was happening here had been going on for a long time. Desperate to learn more, Sarah rifled through the items, hoping to find IDs or personal effects that could provide answers. But each stack had been meticulously stripped of anything that might identify its owner. Even the cameras were empty, no memory cards, no film. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hallway. Sarah froze, her pulse racing. Instinct took over. She bolted out of the room, heading toward the large double doors that led to the chamber housing the spring. As she burst through, an intense wave of heat and a suffocating stench of sulfur enveloped her. Gagging, she fought the urge to cough, her eyes watering. She needed somewhere to hide, fast. Her gaze scanned the room frantically. In the center, a narrow stone path led to what appeared to be an altar built beside the hot spring. At its base was a dark recess just large enough to crawl into. Without hesitating, Sarah darted toward it and squeezed herself beneath the structure, heart pounding, holding her breath, and praying that whoever, or whatever, was approaching wouldn't find her. Sarah recounted in the journal that she hadn't been hiding for long when distant footsteps and hushed voices began to echo through the chamber. Sweat stung her eyes as she remained motionless beneath the altar. Then, she heard something that froze her blood, a young girl's trembling voice, pleading desperately, "I swear I won't climb the fence again. Just let me go. Please, I promise I'll follow every rule. I don't want to get in trouble." Moments later, the girl's begging took a horrifying turn. Her voice shifted to frantic screams and panicked cries, "Please. No. I won't come back, I won't say anything, please, don't, please." While the girl's voice broke into sobs, Sarah began to notice a low, rhythmic hum, several voices speaking in unison. Though she strained to make out the words, the chant was muffled, incomprehensible. Then, as abruptly as it began, the chanting ceased. There was a beat of silence, followed by a scream that pierced the air, sharp and full of agony, only to be silenced just as suddenly by a heavy splash. Sarah wrote that sheer panic overwhelmed her. At first, she feared she had discovered some kind of violent cult ritual. But then, everything shifted. The floor seemed to vibrate as a deep rumble passed beneath her. The heat became unbearable, so intense she feared she might be cooked alive. A wave of nausea hit her as the room filled with a horrid stench far beyond sulfur, something like rotting corpses and sewage, thick enough to make her gag. She fought to remain quiet, even as bile rose in her throat. Suddenly, an overwhelming roar, deep and unnatural, rattled the chamber. It was deafening and short-lived, but it left Sarah trembling, unsure if she had been discovered. She stayed perfectly still, forcing herself to stay silent even though her instincts screamed at her to flee. Gradually, the oppressive heat began to subside, and the awful smell started to dissipate. The air was still thick and warm, but no longer suffocating. Then, the chanting resumed, quieter and shorter this time. She listened as the group's footsteps moved away from the spring. Though tempted to escape immediately, Sarah didn't dare move. She remained hidden, counting the seconds, then the minutes. Only after about half an hour of complete silence did she feel safe enough to move. Carefully, she crawled out from her hiding place and surveyed the room. No one was there. Instinctively, she looked into the spring. It appeared calm and unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Without hesitation, she turned and made for the exit. Bursting into the open air, she felt the crisp mountain breeze cool her sweat-soaked clothes. Running on adrenaline, she sprinted through the forest, not stopping to think. Her mind was still reeling, trying to process what she had just witnessed, if she had witnessed it at all. A part of her wondered if she had stumbled upon something beyond comprehension, something truly evil. Sarah reached her vehicle in record time, much faster than the hike in. Her body was trembling as she threw herself into the driver's seat. Without looking back, she tore down the narrow trail. Swerving onto the main road, heading home with only one thought in her mind: what just happened? And what is this place hiding? Autumn, 1994, my dad and I took a trip that I'll never forget. I was a teenager back then, and spending time outdoors with him was our thing. That fall, we decided to go camping in Yellowstone National Park. It was meant to be a mix of comfort and adventure, one night in a cabin to ease into the wilderness, then 2 nights camping in the forest under the stars. The cabin we stayed in on the first night was small, tucked between towering pines like a forgotten relic. It had all the basics: a pair of beds, a fireplace, and a table for playing cards. The only downside was a rat that shot out from under the bed as we dropped our bags. We both jumped, then laughed it off. Other than that brief moment of surprise, the night was peaceful. We made a fire in the hearth, played a few rounds of cards, and listened to the natural music of the woods, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind brushing against the trees, and the occasional pop from the fire. It felt good to disconnect. Early the next morning, the air was brisk, biting at our skin as we packed up our gear and locked up the cabin. The plan was to hike along into the park, to an area where camping was permitted but not crowded. As we moved away from the roads and amenities, the wilderness began to take over. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining above us to form a green tunnel. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled our noses. And the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the calls of unseen birds echoing through the woods. Strangely, the trail didn't seem as busy as we had expected. Yellowstone is a popular destination, especially in the fall, but we didn't see a single person that day. No hikers, no rangers, no scattered granola bar wrappers or muddy boot prints. It was like we had stepped into a part of the park that no one else knew about. We eventually came upon a small clearing just before midday. A shallow stream trickled nearby, and the sky was wide and open above the clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, pitched our tents, and spent the afternoon fishing and wandering the nearby trails. The quiet was peaceful but almost too perfect, like the forest was holding its breath. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and shared stories, ghost stories, mostly, because that's what you do around a campfire. The flames danced in the wind, casting strange shadows against the tree trunks, and by the time we decided to sleep, the temperature had dropped considerably. We bundled up in our sleeping bags and crawled into our tents. Everything seemed fine, until I woke up. It must have been around 2:30 in the morning. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest was silent, completely, unnaturally silent. Not even an insect buzzed. The silence made my skin crawl. I had a vague, unsettling feeling I couldn't shake, like something was just wrong. I unzipped my tent quietly, trying not to wake my dad, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me hard. I wrapped my arms around myself and walked to the edge of the clearing to relieve myself. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows. But as my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I saw it clearly, a pale face peering at me from inside a bush, no more than 20 feet away. It had no eyebrows, no hair, no teeth, just a wide, awful grin stretched across too white skin. But what froze me in place were its eyes. They were entirely white, except for the thin red veins that webbed across them. No pupils. No irises. Just white, unblinking eyes staring right into me. I stumbled backward and ran, adrenaline kicking in as I sprinted toward my dad's tent. I didn't look back right away, but when I finally did, the face was gone. Just an empty bush, heart hammering. I yanked open my dad's tent and shouted for him to wake up. He shot up instantly, grabbed a flashlight, and came out to meet me. I pointed toward the bush and told him what I'd seen. He didn't laugh or brush it off, he just scanned the area silently, the beam from his flashlight slicing through the dark. "There's nothing there," he said finally, but his voice lacked certainty. Then he froze. I watched the color drain from his face. His hands trembled, and beads of sweat formed on his brow despite the freezing night air. He wasn't looking at the bush anymore, he was looking around the clearing. Eyes wide, like something had just clicked into place. "You know what," he said, his voice low and shaky, "let's just go. Now." I stared at him, confused. I was about to turn back and grab my bag, but he stopped me with a firm grip on my arm. "Leave it," he said. "We're not staying." I didn't argue. We packed up nothing, just took the flashlight and walked quickly, then ran, toward the nearest ranger station. I stayed as close to him as I could. The shadows between the trees felt alive. The further we got from the clearing, the safer I felt, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. When we reached the station, a lone ranger was inside. My dad asked to speak to him privately. I sat a few feet away, trying to calm my nerves, watching their expressions as they talked. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw the ranger's face go pale as he listened. Whatever my dad said hit him hard. Without hesitation, the ranger offered to walk us to our vehicle, which we had parked near the trailhead. We agreed without a second thought. Back in the car, we drove in silence. The sky began to lighten, turning dark blue with the first hints of dawn. My heart had finally stopped pounding, but my mind was still racing. I needed to know what my dad had seen. So I asked him, "What did you see out there?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the road. Then, quietly, he said, "I saw the face. Just like you described." I stared at him, unsure if I should feel relieved that I wasn't hallucinating, but then he added something that made my blood run cold. Only a second before looking back at the road. "I saw it inside your tent." I'm 18 years old and from Northern California. Last year, in 2024, I made a decision that felt like a rite of passage. I planned a solo, overnight camping trip deep in the wilderness. It wasn't a spontaneous decision, I'd been considering it for a while. Something about venturing alone into nature felt like a challenge I needed to take on. The plan was simple: hike a familiar trail all day, veer off trail to camp overnight in a remote spot, then finish the trek the following day where my family would pick me up on a backwoods dirt road. This wasn't just any trail. It's one I've walked before with my dad, and I know it inside and out. It's rarely marked on any maps, and that's part of what draws me to it. It's remote, quiet, and untouched by foot traffic, at least by people. I've never seen another hiker out there, even during the day. There's something special about having the forest to yourself. Normally, I wouldn't have gone out into the woods overnight alone. But something about turning 18 gave me a surge of independence and confidence. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. I chose this particular trail for a specific reason. The area I intended to camp in technically doesn't allow overnight stays due to park regulations. But because the trail itself isn't commonly used and hardly ever monitored, I knew the odds of running into a ranger, or anyone else, for that matter, were incredibly slim. Still, to be extra cautious, I avoided making a campfire that might draw attention. Instead, I brought a small propane stove to cook dinner. My dad dropped me off at the trailhead that morning. I wasn't heading into the wilderness unprepared. I had 3 different knives, a whistle in case of wildlife encounters, especially mountain lions, and years of experience hiking and camping in this region. I was confident and felt ready for the trip. The hike started off beautifully. The forest was alive with early fall color. The sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, and the air smelled of earth and bark and the faint sweetness of dry leaves. I walked for hours, moving deeper into the forest, enjoying the peace and quiet. I stopped occasionally to rest, drink water, or just appreciate the solitude. It was everything I had hoped it would be: peaceful, challenging, and deeply grounding. By late afternoon, I reached my predetermined off-trail camp spot. It was nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by thick forest. I set up my tent, took a few photos, and prepared a modest dinner using my stove. Afterward, I sat and listened to the sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves. The wind drifting lazily through the trees. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep, content and feeling like I had accomplished something real, but sometime in the middle of the night, I jolted awake. At first, there was no sound, just a blanket of silence pressing down on everything. I lay still, eyes open in the darkness, trying to figure out what had stirred me. It might have just been a dream, I thought, or maybe I rolled over too hard. I waited, holding my breath slightly, just listening, then I heard it. A twig snapped nearby. It was close, too close for comfort. My first instinct was to think it might be an animal. Deer, raccoons, even the occasional bear passed through this region. I stayed calm at first. I was about to make a noise to scare it off when I heard it again, two deliberate footsteps crunching on dry pine needles and twigs. The steps were slow and spaced just like a person walking cautiously. That's when fear started creeping in. This wasn't some curious raccoon. It sounded distinctly human. I was far off the trail. I hadn't seen another soul all day. There was no reason for someone else to be out here, especially this deep into the woods, in the middle of the night. Slowly, I reached for my buck knife, which I had placed beside me before going to bed. I gripped the handle tightly, holding my breath. The steps came closer, then paused, not directly in front of the tent, but close enough to make out their presence. The silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps. Then, out of the stillness, came a sound that made my blood run cold, a deep, guttural humming. It was slow, unnatural, and haunting, like something out of a nightmare. There was no question in my mind now, it was a human being out there. But the humming wasn't normal. It wasn't a tune or melody, it was low, like a growl vibrating in a chest. Something about it sounded purposeful. Even ritualistic. I stayed frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to yell, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was gripped by pure, animal fear. The humming continued. It felt like minutes. Every second stretched on. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I heard more footsteps, moving slowly again, but this time, not toward the tent. Then came the unmistakable sound of something scratching against a tree, like a fingernail or maybe a knife dragged across the bark. Without warning, the silence shattered. I heard the person, or whatever it was, sprint off through the underbrush. Branches snapped, leaves rustled violently, and pine needles crunched in a chaotic rush of noise. Then, nothing, silence returned to the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up, clutching my knife, every muscle in my body tense, waiting to hear the footsteps again. But they never came back. I stayed that way, alert, straining to hear even the slightest sound, until the sky finally began to lighten and the first signs of dawn crept in. As soon as it was light enough to see, I got out of the tent and quickly packed my gear. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't pause to rest. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The hike back toward the dirt road felt 10 times longer than the day before. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to step out from the trees. By noon, I reached the pickup point and immediately called my family. When they arrived, I got in the car, still shaken, and told them the entire story. Every detail. I haven't returned to that trail since. I don't know if I ever will. Something about that night fundamentally changed how I view being alone in the wilderness. I still love hiking and camping, but the idea of doing it solo again makes my stomach turn. There are things out there that we can't always explain, and that night, I came face to face with one of them. As for reporting what happened, I decided not to contact the authorities. I couldn't describe a suspect, I hadn't seen a face, and telling the full story would mean admitting that I had camped in a restricted zone. Legally, I wasn't supposed to be there. Besides, who would believe me? There was no proof. No evidence. Just a terrifying memory burned into my mind. To this day, I still replay that sound in my head, the deep, rumbling hum, the slow footsteps, the scratching. It wasn't just someone wandering by. It felt calculated, deliberate, like whoever was out there knew exactly where I was and wanted me to know they knew, so here I am, a year later. Telling my story and still wondering what I heard that night. And what would have happened if I hadn't stayed silent. Thanks for taking the time to read what happened. Stay safe out there, and trust your instincts. Especially when the forest goes quiet. I've only had one truly strange experience while camping, and it took place in Glacier National Park. It's the kind of moment that sticks with you, not just because it was spooky, but because it left me with more questions than answers. It happened on the second night of our stay at the campground. My partner and I were traveling with friends, and that evening, they decided to pitch their tent at the campsite right next to ours. That site happened to be owned and operated by a native family, and they were incredibly warm and welcoming. They shared a wealth of information with us about the area and their ancestral ties to the land. They told us that many generations of their family had lived, and died, on that very ground. And that some of their ancestors were buried close by. It was powerful to hear, and it gave the land a deeper, sacred feeling. We felt grateful to be there and to hear those stories, unaware of how relevant that history would feel by morning. That night, we climbed into our tent, which was mounted on top of our Jeep. It's one of those rooftop tents that you access via a ladder, which we liked for the sense of safety it gave us from wildlife, and honestly, it's just fun. You can always feel when someone is on the ladder. Even a small amount of weight makes the tent shift slightly. It's very noticeable. Sometime deep into the night, I was woken up by my boyfriend's voice. He whispered. "It's okay. It's just the wind." Groggy and disoriented, I blinked a few times and tried to listen. That's when I heard it, fierce, howling wind tearing through the trees. The whole tent was shaking violently, like we were riding out a storm in midair. The wind was so strong it felt like the entire Jeep was about to lift off the ground. Montana's weather can be intense and unpredictable, but this storm felt like something else entirely, sudden, wild, and all-encompassing. Still trying to gather my thoughts, I asked him how long he'd been awake. He hesitated for a second, then admitted that he hadn't slept for quite a while. Something had unsettled him long before the windstorm started. He said about an hour earlier, before the gusts had picked up, he had heard footsteps around our tent. Not heavy adult footsteps, but small, fast ones. The hosts had told us all their children were teenagers or older, well past the age of playing outside late at night. And considering we were surrounded by quiet forestland, the idea of anyone, let alone a child, wandering around in pitch darkness seemed unlikely at best. He said he initially assumed it was maybe a small animal, but the rhythm of the steps didn't feel right. Then, it happened, he felt someone, or something, begin to climb the ladder. That's when he sat up and called out a firm, "Hello." As soon as he did, the weight vanished. Whatever it was quickly dismounted and ran off into the night. I tried to reassure him, offering up explanations, a raccoon maybe, or some animal that managed to climb up. But I didn't believe it myself. The way the ladder shifted wasn't like a squirrel or cat. It felt like a person. And we both knew it. Neither of us slept after that. We laid awake, listening, waiting, every creak and rustle outside making our hearts race. The wind came later, almost like a distraction from the unease we already felt. The next morning, we crawled down from the tent and made our way over to our friend's site to see how they had slept. We hadn't spoken to them since dinner the night before, and we were curious if they had noticed anything strange. Most of them said they'd had a normal night, but one of the guys mentioned that his girlfriend had been freaked out by something during the night. Naturally, we asked her what had happened. She looked a little embarrassed at first, but then said, "I swear, I heard footsteps. It sounded like someone running back and forth past our tent. Then it went quiet for a while, but I was still awake. A little while later, I heard the zipper start to move like someone was trying to open it. I freaked out and yelled, 'Who's there?' My boyfriend and I looked at each other in disbelief. Our experiences had matched almost perfectly, even though we hadn't spoken to them since dinner. None of us had shared anything until that moment, but the pattern of events was nearly identical. When we explained what had happened on our side, how my boyfriend felt someone climbing our ladder, how he called out and they ran off, our friends were just as creeped out as we were. Needless to say, we didn't stick around for another night. To this day, I wish we'd had a chance to speak more with the hosts before we left. Given their cultural background and the reverence they held for their ancestors and the land, I wonder if they might have heard stories like ours before. Maybe they would have had some insight, or at least been able to tell us if others had experienced similar things. But we were too shaken and left early that morning, not wanting to tempt fate. The whole thing felt strange, not threatening exactly, but deeply unsettling. Whoever, or whatever, it was didn't speak. Didn't show themselves, and didn't cause harm. But they were there, and they wanted us to know it. I still think about the footsteps, about the timing of the storm, and about that ladder. The footsteps were light, like a child's, but the presence felt heavier somehow, like it belonged to something older. Something watching. Was it just a prank by someone we didn't see? Was it a spiritual encounter? I'll never really know. But I do know it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just the wind. Whatever it was, it reminded me that some places hold more than just trees and wildlife. Some places hold memories, spirits, or something in between, and some nights, if you're quiet enough, you might just hear them. This past year I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. There was about 600 miles of the trail I hiked/camped alone. One of these sections I was alone was in Northern California, slightly north of Shasta. I got to a beautiful spot and knew it was the best spot to set up camp. It was gorgeous. 360 views of woods in the valley below and mountains everywhere. I could see it raining on Mount Shasta. Probably my favorite campsite in NorCal. I still remember the exact mile and have some footage of the site during daylight. I set up my tent and after admiring the sunset I went to bed. I could see outside below the vestibule when I was lying down in the tent. As I was trying to go to sleep I saw a white light in the valley maybe about a quarter to a half mile away. Not right near my tent or anything. I wasn't close to any towns. In the Sierra Mountains, south of this area, I would see an occasional remote cabin in the woods so I figured it was that. But there were no access points or dirt roads. No forest clearings. Just thick woods surrounded by mountains. I looked at the light for a bit and tried to think of what it could have been but this was pretty remote so I didn't know. I was tired from hiking all day so I didn't think too much of it. A little later I looked out again and noticed another light. It was an orange light slowly circling the white light. It was slowly morphing in shape as it circled. I watched it for a long time trying to understand what I was looking at. It had a very calm motion and it was almost mesmerizing. Around and then vanishes. I eventually fell asleep. It started raining around midnight and I looked out of my tent and still saw both lights, one white stationary light and one orange morphing light. I woke up again around 4 a.m. to piss and walked outside my tent and it was still there. Same motion. I tried to get a video but due to the distance and darkness it looked like another shitty video that didn't show anything. I woke up around sunrise and looked for it but both lights were gone. I didn't see these lights around sunset or sunrise. Only in darkness. I know these would have been visible during sunrise/sunset too. I'm sure there is an explanation, but I genuinely have no clue what I was looking at. Still trying to figure it out, unrelated, but near that area I was walking and to the right of the trail was some thick brush. Maybe 5 to 6 foot tall. This was near the Shasta Trinity Forest area maybe 1 to 2 days after the lights in the woods. I was hiking alone and I noticed about 100 feet away from the brush was being flattened by something and it was moving very quickly. It was approaching the trail and was going to end up right next to me if I had continued my pace. I couldn't see what was flattening this brush but it had to be strong. It reminded me of something you'd see in Jurassic Park. I assumed it was a bear, I still think it was, but I didn't want to surprise the bear and have a close encounter. I yelled stop. And then it stopped. Completely. I remained still and waited to see what was going on, but it was completely still. And it was really quiet everywhere, total silence. I got pretty unsettled and started talking to whatever it was while I walked by. I just kept saying things like, "I am going to walk by and be on my way, my friend. Hope you're having a good day." I kept walking and kept looking back, but nothing moved from that point onward. Like I said, probably a bear. Black bears are generally like big raccoons and don't want to interact with humans. But I encountered a few bears and they always ran away when I told them to get lost. After speaking with other hikers, I noticed I met a few people said how NorCal was a little unsettling. The SoCal desert is very windy and the Sierra Mountains have tons of flowing streams. NorCal doesn't have as many streams or as much wind, so there is just a silence that pervades which can feel ominous, especially in the dark. That's my explanation for the feeling, at least, but after going through the SoCal desert, Sierra Mountains, NorCal, Oregon, and Washington, NorCal was the only section that was a little unnerving to me. And I did portions of each of these sections alone also. A few years ago, I embarked on a solo journey through Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, a place that had always intrigued me with its dense forests and stunning coastal views. I was making my way through Olympic National Park, taking in the serene beauty of the landscape. Along the way, I decided to visit Quinault, a spot I hadn't been to before. The area was known for its tranquility, and I was eager to explore it further. I followed a narrow, winding road, and it led me to an unexpected gem, a beautiful, secluded spot at the edge of the Quinault River. This location was peaceful and quiet, with only the sound of the river rushing beside me and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. At the riverbank, I noticed an ancient footbridge stretching across the water, but it looked old and unstable. I could tell that it hadn't been maintained for a long time, so I decided against trying to cross it. I had no idea what was on the other side, and it didn't seem worth the risk. It was the off-season, so there were no other tourists around, and the entire area felt like it was mine to explore. I was alone, which was exactly what I had wanted. The weather, however, was uncharacteristically warm for fall, which made the idea of dipping my feet into the river even more enticing. After driving to the dead end of the road, I decided to park my car facing outward, making sure it was positioned so I could easily leave when it was time. I grabbed a bottle of water and started hiking through the thick brush, heading down a steep embankment toward the river's edge. There were no designated trails, so I had to push my way through the rugged terrain. I hadn't planned on swimming, but the heat made the cool, inviting river water irresistible. With no swimsuit, I stripped down to my bra and underwear and waded into the river. The water was cold but refreshing, and I relished the feeling of it against my skin. But even as I enjoyed the moment, an odd sense of unease crept over me. I had been hiking alone in wilderness areas before, but this time felt different. There was something about the quiet that seemed a little too still, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I pushed the feeling aside and continued swimming, but it only intensified. Something about the silence felt off, almost as though I were being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation, so after about 5 minutes, I decided it was time to get out of the water and head back to my car. I turned my back to the river and walked toward the spot where I had left my clothes and shoes. I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but no, it was unmistakable. On the opposite bank, across the river, stood a man. He was tall and appeared to be watching me, standing in plain sight, a few yards higher than me on the embankment. His clothes were strange. He wore a poncho made from what looked like animal pelts, and his hair was tangled with sticks and leaves, as if he had been living in the wild for a long time. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the air between us felt thick with tension. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I was frozen in terror, unsure of what to do. I had no idea how he had gotten there or what his intentions were. My mind raced, and I began to feel a creeping fear deep in my chest. I had no way of knowing whether this man meant me harm, but in that moment, I felt like prey. Suddenly, without warning, he turned and started moving in the direction of the footbridge that crossed the river. His movements were quick and deliberate, and in an instant, I knew what I had to do. My survival instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my car keys from my pocket. I tried to gather my clothes, but the blackberry bushes surrounding me had entangled them. Panic set in as I realized I didn't have time to untangle my belongings. I was barefoot, in my underwear, but I couldn't stay there another second. I turned and bolted toward the thick brush, moving as fast as I could. My heart pounded in my chest, and every step felt like it took me further into a nightmare. I knew that if I didn't get to my car before he made it across the bridge, I might be in serious danger. As I broke through the thicket of blackberries, I glanced back and saw him, running fast, closing the distance between us. My car was just ahead, parked at the end of the dead-end road, but I wasn't sure I could make it there in time. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I could see him crossing the bridge toward me, moving with alarming speed. I reached my car, my breath ragged from exertion and fear. I threw open the door and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. He arrived at my car in seconds, and I heard the sound of his fist pounding on the hood. His face was still partially obscured, but I could see his wild eyes and the desperate energy in his movements. He screamed and grunted at me, but there was no intelligible words, only primal sounds that sent shivers down my spine. My pulse raced as I pressed the lock button and held my breath. Without thinking, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and took off. I sped down the road, heart racing, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I dared not look back, but in the rearview mirror, I saw him running after me. He chased my car for nearly a mile, his figure growing smaller in the distance until I could no longer see him. I didn't stop driving until I felt I was far enough away to breathe without panic overtaking me. My body was covered in cuts from running barefoot through the blackberry thorns, and I was shivering, drenched from the river and from the terror I had just experienced. My mind couldn't fully process what had just happened. I was in shock. Had I waited even a moment longer to start my car, there was no doubt in my mind that he would have reached me. To this day, I have never returned to that spot. It's a place that haunts me, an eerie reminder of how close I came to something much worse. Since that day, I've never hiked alone again. I always make sure to have a hiking buddy with me. I don't know who that man was, or why he came after me, but the terror I felt is something I will never forget. The memories of that day are still vivid, and even now, when I think about it, I can feel the fear